One last prayer before taking the bus out of Harasta and into relative safety. The rebels here struck a deal with the Damascus regime. It can take back the enclave so long as the rebels get safe passage to the Syrian areas still under their control, and so long as the civilians who wish to stay behind are pardoned.
This is the second day of evacuations. As you can see, the buses are carrying the rebels from Harasta in Ghouta to Idlib, and we are continuing our operations to clear Ghouta of the last terrorists and killers.
After 6 years of being held by the opposition, Eastern Ghouta is close to falling entirely into the hands of President Bashar al-Assad's men. The logical conclusion of a devastating month-long military offensive backed by Russia on the Damascus suburb. Assad and his allies say it was necessary to end the rule of Islamist militants there and to stop them shelling government areas. The military operation's humanitarian toll prompted global condemnation. One war monitor estimates the incessant shelling and bombing has killed more than 1,600 people, and the United Nations says more than 50,000 people deprived of food and medicine have fled the besieged areas in the last 2 weeks.
Idlib. Those terrorists are leaving. The other terrorist groups inside also now thinking seriously about negotiations, engaging in negotiations with the Syrian government in order to facilitate also such kind of a deal for their exit towards Idlib. So those terrorists of Ahrar al-Sham are the first to accept such a deal after the army encircled them in Harasta. Of course, due to the Syrian army advances here in eastern Ghouta and due to the strong strikes by the Syrian army, terrorists are realizing now that they have no solution but to either accept such a deal and get out safely without a fight towards Idlib, or they will be killed by the Syrian army. The Syrian army is determined to actually eliminate terrorists here and purge the area of terrorist groups, whether through such deals, whether through reconciliation, or whether through the military option. So there is determination clear here, and the Syrian army is continuing with both efforts over here in eastern Ghouta, the humanitarian efforts and the military efforts. Humanitarily speaking, over 96,000 people, civilians, were able to exit from humanitarian corridors established by the Syrian government and Russia, particularly the Wafidin camp corridor and also the Hamouriye corridor. And more civilians are getting out every day from terrorist-held areas inside. Over 80% of eastern Ghouta is now under the control of the Syrian army. And now, just about an hour ago, the Syrian army discovered and controlled a main tunnel that linked the militant-held areas of Harasta with Douma and Medyara. And as the army cuts more and more terrorist supply lines, terrorists are finding that there is no solution for them but either leave or get killed now.
Mohammed, there were consignments of arms intended for the militants in eastern Ghouta that was intercepted by the Syrian army. Were there any more similar incidents in that regard now that it seems to be the end of the rope for the terrorists and militants in eastern Ghouta?
Yes, the Syrian army discovered various depots and warehouses inside eastern Ghouta as it advanced and took control of various militant-held towns over here. The Syrian army discovered even ammunition and arms depots that included also chemical substances and poisonous substances which terrorists used in order to fill them with the mortar shells that they attacked the Damascus and its countryside. The government held part of Damascus with those mortars. So it's not a secret anymore that those terrorists do have poisonous substances that they're using in their mortar attacks on Damascus. This is not something new, and the Syrian army just now, as I told you, discovered this tunnel, and also the terrorists blew up one of their main headquarters in order to not allow the Syrian army to discover what they had inside those headquarters. There were developed computers, high technology devices inside. Communication devices also found burned due to the explosions inside. The terrorists continue to blow up and set ablaze their headquarters in order for the Syrian army to actually not discover such headquarters and make use of maybe perhaps those areas, of course, inside eastern Ghouta, where the militants were positioned. Here, most of the Western and regional support that used to get to those terrorist groups was pouring over into this area. So you can imagine that for 6 years, for over 6 years, since 2012, those terrorists have been getting all the support they need, Western and regional support, food, medicine, computers, communication devices, arms and weapons, everything used to pour into this area here of Eastern Ghouta. So definitely it is expected that the army could discover more and more warehouses and headquarters for the terrorist groups. But in such deals, prior to leaving, the militants always burn those headquarters usually, not just here in Eastern Ghouta, but this is what happened also in Aleppo. But in Aleppo, there was a larger quantity perhaps discovered of weapons and ammunition that the terrorists did not have time to burn at that time and destroy. But here we have to wait and see what will happen when the Syrian army purges and enters the entire Eastern Ghouta.
All right, thank you very much, Mohammed. Press TV's Muhammad Ali joining us from Eastern Ghouta in the Damascus country.
Hundreds of militants and their families are expected to evacuate Harasta in Eastern Ghouta under a Russian brokered deal between a militant group and the Syrian government. Empty buses started entering the town in preparation to move out some 1,500 militants and 6,000 of their family members. Under the deal, Ahrar al-Sham terrorists have agreed to disarm before getting safe passage to militant-held areas in Idlib province. Those who choose to stay will receive a pardon under the terms of local reconciliation with Syrian authorities. Some 80,000 people have already evacuated the violence-hit district through humanitarian corridors established by government forces. Damascus has so far managed to recapture more than 80% of Eastern Ghouta since it launched a major offensive last month. Our correspondent in Syria, Muhammad Ali, earlier updated us on the evacuation deal between the government and terrorists in Eastern Ghouta.
The process continues. The deal will be implemented today. Terrorists, about 1,500 terrorists, will be leaving Eastern Ghouta, particularly Harasta, along with 6,000 civilians who make up their families. Just behind me are more and more buses, empty buses, getting prepared to enter into Harasta in order to pick up those terrorists and their families. This is the first deal of evacuating civilians and terrorists, particularly terrorists from Eastern Ghouta, not just since February when the Syrian army started this military offensive against them, but also since the start of the war. This militant-held region, terrorists here have been fortified for all that time, and they have refused to accept such deals to get out from Eastern Ghouta. But today, because of the Syrian army's offensive that led to encircling those terrorists fully and cutting all of the supply lines that links them together and even links them with areas that they have been getting the Western and regional support from, meaning the border areas from Jordan, previously from Lebanon, all the way towards Eastern Ghouta. After cutting all of those supply lines, the terrorists now have no choice. They know that they will either be killed or accept such a deal.